Public expenditure during the boom climbed from a modest $586 million in 1973 to a high of $9.4 billion in 1982. Overall expenditure reached $35.5 billion during that period, with more than $21 billion devoted to current expenditure. The current expenditure was used to provide wages and salaries, basic services, and subsidies. The capital expenditure was invested primarily on the government's development programs, with its major concentration on developing a major industrial estate at Point Lisas on the west coast. The industries on the estate were to use the country's large deposits of natural gas both as a fuel and feedstock. The government also invested heavily on infrastructure and utilities. The influx of money was so rapid that the government ended up doing everything at the same time.
Attempted to do too much at the same time. And there was a reason for it. This country was catching its ass up to 1970-74, boom, when we get money. And it would happen in any country, any family. But if all of a sudden you get a windfall, you start spending money as if money going out of style. Unfortunately, money has gone out of style. But it is inevitable that when you have this tremendous amount of money to be spent, a lot of it is going to be wasted. I'm not saying there's right. I'm just saying what is fact.
The technocrats felt that the major problem with the government's investment and development programs was that there was no multi-sector planning. Instead, sectoral planning was adopted.
When we arrived at the end of the third five-year plan, 1973, it was said at that time that planning had lost its mystique and that the country should move away from planning. And this is what it did. And I believe that the fact that money was available was an added incentive to the government to depart from planning as a strategy of development. Instead, what the government did was to confine itself to what one would call, what has been called, sectoral strategies.
We had no model to enable us to assess the implications of what we were doing. And we would go into a large number of projects, each of which was competing for a fixed amount of resources.
When we add up the state expenditure, we would find that really and truly, a lot of that money was misspent. It was misspent in terms of bad investment decisions taken insofar as the industrialization policy, the iron and steel plant, the methanol plant, the urea plant, which were predicated on export markets, and which export markets have never really materialized in the kind of way that was planned, and therefore there have been massive losses there.
If you look back at the demand for ammonia and fertilizer and all these things, you will see that the demand is cyclical. And therefore, one of the things you had to guard against was the question of access to markets.
I would say that the reason why we have seen such disastrous failures with respect to these massive investments is because the decisions were taken without taking into account what was most desirable for Trinidad and Tobago in the long term.
The mistakes were not only made in the so-called prestige and mega projects. The rest of the state sector also gobbled up vast amounts of oil money, and many of the companies were not viable. By 1982, the state enterprises were collectively worth $3 billion. The state owned or had shares in 66 companies. 34 of these were fully owned. Government had controlling interest in 14 and minority shares in 17. One, a joint venture air cargo company with Barbados, was on a 50-50 basis. The government bought many of these companies in the interest of social stability.
A government is not a business, contrary to popular opinion in some quarters. That a government's primary responsibility is social order. Social order. Therefore, you just can't look at the dollars and cents aspects of it. Yes, if you can make a profit, by all means, that assists. It makes money available so that you can do other things. But you have to improve the quality of life of people, and unemployment is very important in that context.
Surely that doesn't make sense. A government has a duty to use the resources of the state in the most efficient way so that it redounds to the benefit of the entire community. It is a short-term policy merely to take over an industry and employ as many people as you possibly can in the industry, knowing full well that that will make the industry non-viable. Surely, sooner or later, that has got to stop. And then the very people you are trying to help will now find themselves on the breadline. It would have been better if, when having taken the industries, that they ensured they were viable and that they were making surpluses so that those surpluses could go into other industries, setting up other industries. And that is the kind of strategy that I would have used in order to deal with the unemployment problem.
The state sector became a major burden on the taxpayer. The capital investment was only one part of the expenditure on the state companies. Many were not viable, and instead of insisting on their viability, large sums of support funds were pumped into them because money was no problem. In 1981, for example, nearly $900 million went into direct support payments and $1.4 billion in loans and credit, a total of more than $2 billion in a single year to support a bloated state sector that lacked the discipline and management capability for survival.
Almost every part of the state sector was non-viable. Even those undertakings, those enterprises, which were commercial enterprises, were non-viable. And that is because what they were doing is merely using the national patrimony for patronage.
Don't forget that the largest single employer in the country is the government. And there are a lot of votes tied up in that. I mean, there are sort of votes of not just employees, but families of employees, and almost every company in Trinidad to some extent is dependent on government for its continued operations.
First time I went in the cabinet, I said to Chambers, I said, PM, what we spending $250 million a year on Caroni for? They don't vote for us. And he told me, boy, Ronnie, it's 10,000 people. What do you expect me to do with them? That's one aspect which Chambers says a damn fool. They don't vote for us. Or we try to bribe them by keeping it open and they don't vote for us still.
Caroni Limited became the whipping boy among the state enterprises, but it was by no means the worst. If social stability could be justified as a reason for keeping a state corporation alive, then Caroni would have had the biggest case for state subsidy, since it employed 10,000 people directly and an equal amount indirectly. But there was more to the Caroni story. At least 4 major studies commissioned by the government pointed to rationalization as a means of making the sugar company viable. But the company was a political pawn, its workers forming the power base of the parliamentary opposition for 30 years.
The disaster was Caroni. What was it, 1974, 75? 75, a year after, boom. With all the oil boom, commodity prices went up. I think that was the first year the first and only year Caroni made a profit. It was some ridiculous price of sugar. And of course, we know what Caroni is today. A dude. It is nothing else but a dude.
Caroni Limited could have been profitable if Caroni Limited was rationalized. They argued that Caroni Limited was non-viable because the price of sugar on the world market was so much lower than the cost of production. If that is the case, then it seems to me obvious that you move away from the production of sugar as your end product and move into those products in which there are high value-added content. That they did not do.
In terms of direct contributions other than capital expenditure and subsidies, other state companies were just as parasitical. ISCOT, the iron and steel company, headed the list with more than $500 million, with the same amount going to the national airline BWIA. A task force appointed by the PNM administration to develop a multi-sector plan for developing the country in the post-boom years sharply criticized the structure of the state sector. The task force, headed by the president of the Caribbean Development Bank, William Demas, said, The sector reveals no common financial, economic, or strategic organizing principle, and the companies display no common factor or group of factors which may have determined their status. The report pointed particularly to the creation of companies where no kind of return on investment was possible. When there were problems in hospital management, the hospital management company was created as a separate entity. A secondary roads company was formed to look after maintenance of roads, while local government authorities and the Works Ministry still had overall control. The same happened with a solid waste company to handle waste disposal, while local authorities had staff and equipment to do the job. It was a classic case of organizational and administrative chaos. Today, the government is faced with the burden of what to do about this large state sector, which employs more than 31,000 people.
As a matter of fact, a committee has been set up to rationalize their public enterprises. And we are hoping that when we've received that report, we would be better equipped to approach the whole question of state enterprises. You know, the government has talked of divestment of some of the state enterprises. And we're hoping that the divestment would take place in such a way that the workers would not suffer, that the workers themselves would be participants in the divestment scheme.
The public utilities also fell within the state enterprises. They suffered from the usual management problems, but they had additional ones. They did not decide their investment programs independently, neither did they have control over their rates and charges. They were also plagued by industrial problems, which were aggravated by the fact that the utilities themselves had to deal with workers and trade unions, while government or state agencies determined the broad framework within which they could function. During the boom, the public utilities consumed the largest share of subsidies, more than $1 billion. It was one way to keep inflation down, cover up the mismanagement, and keep voters happy.
In fact, what the government should have been doing was trying at that point in time when people could pay and would not have, in fact, they might have made some noise about paying, but they would have paid.
I think that possibly we kept in place subsidies for far too long. There should have been a gradual sort of easing away from subsidies, which we had to do finally. But it was such a massive blow.
If the government had adopted a more stringent policy, I wouldn't even say a more realistic policy with regard to the tariff policies of the utilities, at that point in time, we would not have a situation today where those utilities, for instance, one of them today, the telephone company, has a debt of over $1 billion. Now, that is rather phenomenal if one looks at it, if one looks in terms of a debt today in 1986, 87 of $1 billion. And one remembers that you didn't have a budget of $1 million in 1974, budget for the entire country. So that this is part of the sort of euphoria, or if I so, the lack of planning again, which I keep coming back to that, because I think that is an important factor.
Money was no problem, so the government used a surplus to pay subsidies for a wide variety of goods and services. In 1973, the subsidy program used $28 million and concentrated on a few essentials in order to keep inflation at a realistic level. By 1980, the subsidy bill had reached $1 billion. By 1978, when the first oil shock was over, government was cautioned about its welfare expenditure and overemployment in the state sector. A special committee under Dr. Uric Bob, who was at that time the deputy governor of the central bank, reviewed government's expenditure. Among the Bob Committee's recommendations were that government should not adopt any new welfare program or improve existing ones, that government should be cautious about increasing permanent employment in the civil service, and that there should be no further tax reductions. Nobody seemed to have taken the Bob report seriously. Perhaps it was the timing. It came just before the second oil shock, which sent oil prices over $34 a barrel. Money was available to continue to build crutches for a people who had already been spoilt by government's pampering. Although some welfare programs were scaled down, the emphasis on large-scale capital expenditure remained. And like the period 1973 to 1979, all the developmental problems were there. Few projects were rigorously evaluated. Construction continued to boom, and there were massive delays and bottlenecks. The government was itself expressing deep concern over cost overruns and delays, especially in government-to-government contracts. The trouble with the construction bottlenecks was that they pushed completion deadlines so far back that cost escalated sometimes by 100%, and in the case of major projects, the earning potential was lost.
Time is an important factor in economic development. Now, if those industries, the industries that have been established and are in operation, are functioning today, had been functioning in a period when the market was different to the way it is today, the situation would be much different.
The industrial thrust provided few jobs, and the wealth caused a decline in the non-oil productive sector. Tourism, manufacturing, and agriculture were the principal casualties. Export agriculture declined sharply in spite of government support mechanisms. One of the reasons attributed to this was the difficulty in getting labor.
But they leave agriculture under two conditions. One is when opportunities are better in the manufacturing and service areas. And secondly, when they're driven from the land by the process of rationalization of the agricultural holdings.
Domestic agriculture enjoyed a number of subsidies, but lacked the proper infrastructure with respect to production and marketing.
The biggest problems that the farmer in this country faces is flood control, flood problems, flooding. And when your physical facilities for flood control and the reverse of flood control, which is irrigation, when those are not in place, then the farmer is disenchanted.
We used to import $900 million worth of food for 1.2 million people. It meant that agriculture just declined to abysmal levels. We are trying to resuscitate the agriculture. In other fields, tourism is totally ignored. Tourism is totally ignored. And tourism, as you know, has a ripple effect in the economy if you can tie in your productivity with tourism. In the area of light manufacturing, in the area of fisheries, these are things they just didn't bother with at all. They went into prestige projects, steel and urea, that sort of thing.
Unlike agriculture, manufacturing grew from $202 million in 1973 to more than $1 billion by 1982. But this growth was really a response to the buoyant economy and the great liquidity in the financial system. With few exceptions, manufacturing was based on assembling products for the consumer market. This meant a heavy dependence on foreign exchange for technology and components. Many of these assembly-type industries grew during the boom in spite of the high cost of labor, because there was a ready market at home. And since money was no problem, consumers were just there to take the goods off the assembly line without any regard for price. This consumerism could only be supported because the boom had created a thriving middle class that emerged from the shop floors and the plantations. Everybody was in a rush to trade their old lifestyle for the new. The Cinderellas were out partying, and midnight seemed far away.